Let us look at themes in history of of East Africa since 1871 to present. So today we are going to look at the British colonial economic policies, in East Africa. Looking at the British colonial economic policies, so after acquiring and establishing their role in Uganda and Kenya, the British carried out a number of economic and social policies which helped them maintain their stay in East Africa. So after the British and the European powers are settling into East Africa, they focused on setting up different economic policies which could help them to stay in East Africa for some good time. And a good example is Britain and Germany. So let us look at what they do in terms of economy. So the economic policies included the following. So agriculture is one of the economic policies that these people staged to stay in East Africa. So the British introduced compulsory growing of cash crops in order to make Africans meet their own costs of administration. Kenneth Borup introduced cotton in 1905. So after Kenneth Borup introducing cotton growing in Uganda in 1905, many of the Ugandans adopted the cash crop growing or cotton growing, and still when you look at Kenya also adopted the cotton growing and coffee growing. So Kenneth Borup, who introduced this kind of growing, he ended up making Africans adopt this crop which was introduced. So compulsory agriculture was introduced, whereby many of the Africans it was a must. It was not optional for you to plant these cash crops. It was through force. Altogether, that's why even in Uganda they introduced the system called Chiboko. It was a must. You had to plant these cash crops. Altogether, this was the goal of the colonial masters. Taxation was another economic policy these people embarked on that relied on in East Africa. So the Africans were introduced a new system of paying taxes in cash form, a system that was totally new to them. Hat tax was introduced, gun tax was introduced, and it was made compulsory, whereby whoever that possessed a gun had to pay for it. Whoever that had a hat had to pay for it. So people ended up converging to a single hat after realizing that they could not afford, and that's why at the end of the day they revolted against the British kind of rule. So taxation was another economic policy for them to get enough funds from Ugandans, for them to get enough funds from Kenyans that could at least support their stay in East Africa. Industrialization was yet another economic policy that was employed by the British. So the British destroyed traditional industries to make Africans totally dependent on European-made goods. So they only set up small processing plants like grainers to introduce on the bulk of the raw materials for export. So many of the European goods, after Europeans settling into Africa, they embarked what they did to make sure that Africans depend on them only. It is to freeze their industries, making their own industries accessible. So what they did is to make sure that African industries collapse and Africans remain start depending on them. So they made Africans dependent to depend on them only. Altogether, so time came when Africans could only survive on the European goods. Reason being, their home industry or their traditional industries were freezed by the Europeans, and that was one way of making Africans depending on them only. The Africans became dependent. So forced labor was also another factor that was also another economic policy that Europeans used in East Africa. So Africans were forced to provide labor on large plantations and in the same construction of roads, lairies, ports, and harbors. So Africans were forced by the Europeans to come or to work for them in public work. So there was forced labor. Africans were taken as slaves to work on the European plantations. Africans were forced to do public work like construction of roads, railways, and ports, among others. And at the end of the day, Africans became workers for the Europeans. Land alienation, that is all, land division, was also another factor. That was also another reform. It was also another economic policy that Europeans employed. Africans lost a lot of land to the white settlers in Kenya, Nila Highlands, and to the construction of the transport line, the railway line, schools, hospitals, yet no compensation was made. So Europeans grabbed land from Africans. Europeans divided the land of the Africans amongst themselves. Look at the Kenyans. So the Kikuyu, that's why they were able to stage up the Mau Mau rebellions after losing their Kenyan highlands to the British altogether. So land grabbing was another method, or was another economic policy that these people employed. Transport was yet another economic policy that these people employed to ensure effective control over East Africa. So several roads were established altogether. Several roads were established, and after them constructing several roads, vehicles were introduced, and at the end of the day, they were also able to establish what they call the Uganda Leyiri, which they established from Mombasa, and it reached Kampala in 1931. So after it reaching in Kampala, transport was made easy, and at the end of the day, the work of the colonial masters became easy or smoothened in East Africa. Education is yet another economic policy employed by the colonial masters, whereby Africans were specifically taught Western culture, Western syllabus. And it should be noted that after Africans learning Western culture, they ended up forgetting their own culture, and they were assimilated. Missionaries, when they came, they emphasized more of Western culture, and they preached against the African culture. So this made them to at least to ensure that all Africans adopt their culture, living their own culture. Healthy is yet another economic policy that these people use to ensure their effective control over African territories. Better health services were introduced, and the missionaries did a lot in this sector. They did a commendable job. Igi, the white's father, built different hospitals. Look at the Zambia hospital. The CMS, the Church Missionary Society, built Mengo Hospital, where Africans or where people went for treatment, and still these hospitals are still there. If you go to Zambia Hospital, it is under now the Catholic Church supervision, and Mengo Hospital in Mengo there. Introduction of new currency was yet another economic policy employed by by the British in Uganda. This was done, and it was done to replace the old version of trade, which was barter, goods for goods, service for services. First, cowrie shell was introduced, was used, and Indian rupees and later all coins were also introduced. These were later followed by the establishment of banking sectors were set up, whereby Africans used to go and keep their money, or they used to go and bank up their money. So urbanization is also another economic policy that was employed by the British in Uganda. Trade centers, towns, and big cities were all developed, especially along the railway line: Igi, Mombasa, Nairobi, Nakuru, Kampala, Tororo, Mbare, and Kasese, among others. So, where Africans gained from the colonial economic policies, it was by accident and not designed. Are we together? No, so Africans gained from the economic policies introduced by the Europeans accidentally, though it was not the goal of the colonial masters for Africans to gain from their policies. So Africans, wherever they gained, it was by accident. But all in all, the British were just doing this to to make their work easy, not to help Africans. So Africans gained accidentally, Africans benefited from the roads established by the colonial masters accidentally, and it is like this. If it was possible for the Europeans to take their roads and they would have gone with them, but since they could not take them, Africans benefited accidentally. I beg to submit. Have a good day.